the DAWbench Radio Show, the official podcast of DAWbench.com.
Welcome to the DAWbench Radio Show. I'm your host, Curigliano of AAVIM Technology in Melbourne, Australia. And I am joined again today, co-hosting by Pete Brown of Microsoft in Maryland in the United States. Hey, Pete, how you going?
Good. How are you, Vin?
Very, very good.
Up bright and early.
Yeah, with the crack and the birds. We don't necessarily need to talk about the weather because everyone knows we're at polar opposites of the planet.
Right.
Now, today we have a special guest coming in from Galisteo, New Mexico. I hope I pronounced that correctly. That's in the United States, obviously. And that is Paul Davis, who is the founder and lead developer of Ardour, which is a leading open source cross-platform DAW application. Welcome, Paul.
Thank you very much, Finn. Nice to be here.
You're most welcome, Paul. Now, I am going to just quickly start off, as I usually do, with an overview of my history with Ardour, or Ardour. Ardour? How do you pronounce it?
Well, the pronunciation varies a little bit. I generally say Ardour.
Ardour.
I'd say a lot of Europeans say Ardour.
Ardour, yeah. Okay.
So.
Right. Okay. Well, I say Ardour. My history is not very long. I have been dabbling with Linux for a couple of decades. So that was my first introduction to the DAW when I was playing with some of the Linux distributions back in the early 2000s, around 2006 to 2010, somewhere around there. And I remember there was a Ubuntu Studio distribution that featured the application. So that was my first introduction, and I have been keeping tabs on it. I remember, I went to OSX and then it finally made its way to Windows, and I had a bit of a look back then, which was, I think, around 2015. But admittedly, I haven't really been keeping up much past that. I do know that it's an underpinning of some other third-party software as well, which we can get into a little bit later. So I don't have a lot of history, but I've always kept an eye on it, and I'm very happy to be able to chat to you more about it. And look, I admittedly, I should have been keeping up a little bit closer because the application just looks fantastic at the moment. So we can get into that those details further. But I think to start off, what would be really good would be to just give the listeners an overview of your own personal history regards computers, music technology and programming, and your eventual journey to developing Ardour.
Sure. I'd be happy to do that.
Cool.
So I guess I'm almost 58, and I think I first got my hands on a computer in about 1978 or 79.
Wow. Okay.
I wasn't programming, but I went into my stepfather's office and they had some British mini computer in there that I got to play a very early computer game called Space War on.
Right.
And I didn't touch a computer again probably for another 5 years after that. But there was definitely something about that encounter that stuck in my mind. What is this thing? Like, what does it do? And I ended up at university in the UK between 83 and 86. And I think even probably in the first year of that, we had these BBC Model B microcomputers in the university library that you could just sit down in front of and do anything with them. And I started dabbling around in that sometime during my first year there. by the end of university, I had gotten, well, I mean, I'm not really sure I felt that far into computers in the sense I didn't really have access to a lot of computing power or even a lot of mentors, but my focus had turned to computational biology. And I did a senior year thesis that was all computationally based. When I look back on it, it's, incredibly primitive, but, forced me to grapple with the fundamentals of programming and thinking about computers and what you could do with them. I went on to start a PhD that was also in computational biology, initially to do with analyzing the 3D structure of DNA and then moving on to protein folding. But after a year of doing that, I had this very strong feeling that protein folding was a problem that was going to take at least 25 years to get anywhere with.
Right.
And history has proved me more than correct. There has been, if you guys follow the news on this, Google's alpha stuff has made some gigantic steps forward, but it's 30 years since I quit doing that.
Yep.
And I had this very strong feeling that I was more engaged by the computers than I was by the biology. So I dropped out of my PhD, moved back to the UK, and got a job as a programmer, and was there for about 18 months before I emigrated to the US in 1989. Started working for a small company out in Seattle, and then moved to the University of Washington Computer Science Department, which is a really great 4.5 years of just hanging out with a bunch of really smart people. But toward the end of that time, I realized I wasn't really doing enough programming. I was, the job had turned out to be much more system administration than it was actual programming. And I started to look around for something else. And got put in touch with this guy that wanted to start a company selling books online that you all know quite well.
Yes.
And so in 1994, I left the university and became the second employee at Amazon.
Wow.
It was just myself, Jeff Bezos, and another programmer. And that was certainly a lot more programming. It was a lot of fun, kind of being in charge of getting Amazon up and running.
What year was that, Paul?
I started working there in late 94.
All right. So that's, really early on. Yep. Okay. Yep.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. I mean, it was literally just myself, Jeff, and one other programmer hanging out in a converted garage.
I wonder how much of your code is still running on the website there.
Very little. I mean, I've done a couple of patent lawsuits in sort of the orbit around Amazon during the last 20 years, and that's caused me to have, tiny amounts of contact, but tiny bits of contact nevertheless with people who are still there. And I think there's very little left anymore. They did keep some of it around for a lot longer than I would have expected, but it's pretty much all gone now. Some of the fundamental concepts are still floating around, but it's 25 plus years later, you wouldn't really expect it to be that way. So I was there, and I guess in the middle of, I guess not in the middle of, I'm trying to think when. I guess my first wife became pregnant sometime in 94, and our daughter was born in January of 95. And I had already told Jeff that this was going to be happening, and that after she was born, I would want to work just 3 days a week. And he was fine with that. He told me much later that the only reason he was fine with it was that he felt that when he met me, he knew I was a person who would be thinking about work 24/7. Which I'm not really sure is a compliment, but actually turned out to be true. Anyway, so in January of 95, my daughter was born. So starting sometime around February or so, I switched to a 3-day week there, splitting, raising our daughter with her mother. By the end of 95, the corporate culture of Amazon was beginning to become a little clearer. And I'm sure you guys and listeners are aware that thankfully there's a lot of controversy and a lot of discussion now about Amazon's corporate culture. that was starting to form very early on, and I really didn't want to be a part of that. I also had a wife who was trying to finish her PhD. I had always thought of being a stay-at-home parent, and it seemed to me that the obvious thing to do was to just quit and, become a full-time parent and get it out of what I was doing. So in something like, I don't know exactly when, sometime very early in 1996, I left Amazon. And I became a stay-at-home parent. My first wife finished her PhD. We moved back to the East Coast of the US to Philadelphia, where she was doing a postdoc. And I just started raising my daughter. And that could have been the end of it. Because to be honest, at that point, I was really kind of tired of programming. I felt like I'd gotten into it without really planning to. And I just felt like it wasn't something that I wanted to really do anymore. But I would guess, that within a year or two of that, for various reasons, I was starting to look around for hobbies to supplement, being a stay-at-home parent. And I'd always had an interest in listening to electronic music. And I thought, maybe I should try to make some stuff. And I bought, what did I get? I bought a DAW MAQ 16.3 analog sequencer. It's not an analog sequencer, sorry. It's a MIDI step sequencer. And I bought a Matrix 6.
Yes.
And an effects unit, and started trying to do some stuff. And immediately the question became, well, okay, I need to record. And then the question became, well, what am I going to record with? And I had, so this was probably in 1990, late 97, sometime in 98 perhaps. And it was clear that, computer recording was a thing now, and that was what people were starting to do. But, and I say this with all seriousness, although it's really quite hilarious to put it this way, I'd taken a vow in the 80s that I would never use Microsoft's operating system for anything. So I wasn't going to violate that vow. And, Macs were a possibility, but they were expensive, and I didn't really feel as though I wanted to spend that much at that point. I didn't know if this would be like a 2-week, flirtation with this stuff or something else. And I thought back to, I had been working on Unix systems pretty much since I got into computing. I never did Windows. I never really was a Mac user. I had worked on Unix from the mid-'80s onwards. And when I was at Amazon, I had been responsible for bringing in a Linux system there that was used to manage credit card stuff. It was not on the internet. And we just needed a cheap, small machine that we could do sneakernet stuff with, transferring stuff on disk. And I had bought Linux in there, and, it seemed to me like, yeah, it's just another Unix. And so, okay, well, I guess I should get myself some sort of cheap used computer, and I'll put Linux on it, because I'm sure there'll be some recording software, right? And there was a program at that point called Multitrack. I was very excited and fired it up and thought, this is it, my new recording hobby / career. And it turned out to be just, I'm not going to say it was garbage. I don't think that's fair. It was completely incapable of doing what I needed to do. It wasn't a DAW by any means. And I looked around at some other things that were around on Linux. There's an insanely powerful audiophile editor that's called SND. And, if you're a hacker and a nerd and a geek and want to do audiophile editing, SND is just insane. But unfortunately, it is also not a DAW and can't really do multi-track recording and so on. So I think I kind of put the recording part on hold for a while and set about starting from the other end of things, which is doing composition. So I started writing some MIDI composition tools. For example, a step sequencer that was more like the MAQ 16's bigger brother, and I did some other MIDI composition tools. And that was fun. I could run sequencers and make noises and stuff, and I wouldn't want anybody else to hear what I was doing, but there was stuff was being played. Oh, and I guess actually also in that time, I had done device drivers for Unix systems in the past as well. And so I ended up writing a device driver for the audio, the audio interface I was using, just because there wasn't one for it for Linux.
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess somewhere in 1999, RME announced what was the name of the model? I'm trying to think which model they released. It was the Digi 9632, I think.
Yeah, no, that was a little bit later, but they did have the Digi. It was the first series of the Digi cards, and the name escapes me. Digi 32, I think it was, something like that.
Yeah, there was the Digi 30. I think it was the 9632, because the earlier ones weren't as interesting for some deep down technical reasons. But
right.
the 9632 was announced,
right?
And I remember thinking, oh, wow, 24 channels of audio. Well, I mean, that would solve all of my problems. But, there's no driver for it. Well, it turned out actually there was a driver on Linux for it, written by a guy in Austria. But he had written the driver as a standalone thing. He didn't integrate it with the rest of the audio subsystem on Linux. And I didn't think that was very satisfactory. So I took the work that he had done and the interactions he had had with RME, carried on interacting with RME, and wrote a driver for the card that would integrate properly with the rest of the audio subsystem.
Right.
And, that was done, I don't know, sometime in like November or December of 99. And it was like, well, this is really cool. I can get 24 channels in and out of my Linux machine. I guess I need a recorder.
Yeah.
So the next part, and I do love this story too, is I thought, well, Pro Tools looks like a pretty good system. Mm-hmm. It's too bad that it doesn't run on Linux. So I just called them up and told them I would like to port it. I would like to port it to Linux for them for free. Of course, they just laughed.
Yeah.
And that didn't go anywhere. So then the ultimate act of programmer hubris kicked in. And I remember thinking, I mean, how hard can it really be to write a DAW anyway? So I just set about writing one. My daughter wasn't, so another small personal detail, in the period between then and when I had moved back to Philadelphia, my first wife and I had gone to a divorce. So that particular Christmas, my daughter wasn't going to be with me. She was going to be with her mother. And so I had a fair amount of time that Christmas and New Year's to sort of start thinking about stuff. So, I'll just write a recorder. And it turned out that actually writing a recorder wasn't very hard. I think in like 2.5 weeks, 3 weeks, I had a 24-track recorder that you could play back on and stuff. And I did all the graphics modeled on, there was a Mackie machine at that point called HDR24. Mm-hmm. And I did the GUI based on images of that machine. And the functionality was really modeled very closely on that machine. And that was cool. Except that, recording and playing back, as anybody who had one of those machines might know, it just isn't really enough, right? At some point, you want to edit the stuff. And we couldn't do that yet. And I guess by the time it rolled around to, like March or April of 2000, there were a couple of other people who were getting involved in the project at that point. And we sort of had an online discussion about this problem, like we need an editor. And we sort of all looked at it. Well, we didn't literally look at each other. There was no Zoom at that point, but we metaphorically looked at each other and once again said, well, how hard can it be? And so we started. And here I am 21 years later, and it hasn't finished yet.
Yeah.
So that was sort of the journey through computing and how I ended up writing Ardour. It was originally supposed to be, the original impetus came purely out of me wanting to have a multi-track recorder and editor that I could use on Linux. So
necessity was the mother of invention. Essentially.
Yeah. I mean, if Digi had actually given me the source code to Pro Tools and just said, go for it, then, then we might live in a very different world today, but that isn't what happened. So
hey, I love that the basics here is just how hard could it be? And that's underlying everything that you've done here.
Yeah. And I think, it's strange 21 years later, there's a part of me that still wants to turn around and say, how hard can it be? Even though I've witnessed, how hard it is. But, you know, there is some aspect to it, especially the incremental nature of things, that in some respects does mean that there's never really been a particular point in time along the way that it actually has felt hard. It's just that then you look back on it and say, wait, how long did this take?
Yeah. Look, and what's interesting as well, Paul, is your decision to maintain it as an open source, which is very, very unique in the professional DAW development world. So do you want to talk a little bit about the reasonings that you've wanted to maintain it as an open source project?
Yeah. So back at my first real job as a programmer, which was working for a large multinational called Schlumberger, they had a research unit in Cambridge in the UK, and a guy that I had known, there was a guy who worked for the computing services division at the institution where I was doing my PhD, and he knew I had quit, and he knew I was going back to England, and he had just gotten a job back at this research facility in Cambridge. And, you know, he called me about a month after I'd left and said, are you still looking for a job? And I had said, yeah, Neil, I am. It's only been a month. I'm still looking for a job. And as a result of that interest, I ended up working with him as a systems programmer there. And I don't know entirely what his background or interest in free software and the GNU project was, but even by the time that I met him, and remember, you know, this is still only 80. I mean, I met him in 86, and I started working for him in 87 or early 88. It's not very long after the whole of the free software movement had started. But he was a huge believer in the ideals behind it, I think both at a technical level, in the sense that, you know, there's a strong belief that software needs to be open. The people who use it need to be able to modify it. And that was particularly true back in that era when, let's be realistic, most of the people that used software were highly technical users. They weren't, you know, people just doing spreadsheets or email. And I think he also had a fairly strong commitment to it for ideological, sociological, economic, political reasons too, in terms of a belief about what control over technology means and why it's important and so on. And his ideas really rubbed off on me a lot. I don't really know why they found such a strong home in me. I'm not quite sure what that connects back to, but to be honest, it just seemed obvious to me. It's, you know, it's like, why would you not be able to access the source code? And in fact, this was really a part of the reason why I had vowed that I would never use Microsoft products, because Microsoft, certainly in the 80s and really arguably in the 90s and the aughts, were companies absolutely fundamentally opposed to open source on every level. And I was absolutely in favor of the idea that all software should be open. I couldn't really see any reason why it should be closed. So that was sort of the philosophical background. But now you fast forward to, 2000 or so, and it was a more practical reason, which is that it divides into two parts, really. There was a bunch of libraries that it was obvious that, well, no, let me back up a second. I was not planning to write everything in this DAW from scratch. It was just stupid. First of all, I already was involved with open source, and I knew that was just a dumb idea. If there were libraries out there that did useful things, like reading audio files, for example, there's no point in sitting down and writing all that stuff from scratch. And so I wanted to be able to use those libraries, and the libraries that I knew about were open source. And I was doing this at that point very much as a hobby project. I wasn't going to end up paying some small software development house money for a license for a non-open source library. So that was kind of a no-brainer. But the second reason was that it seemed to me at the time much more likely that I would be able to get collaborators if I did this as an open source project. Now, I mean, I could say a lot more about that and probably will later, but as a motivation, that felt fairly strong. Like, if I start this as another closed source thing, it's just going to be me. If I make it open source, who knows what will happen? And I think my feelings about that got confirmed very early on when these two other guys, Tabin and Jesse, got very involved in the project very early on. And I just don't think that's something that would have happened. After a certain point, I would say even less than a year into the project, really, if you've already made that level of commitment to open source, particularly in terms of the libraries that we were already using, at that point, it's pretty hard to ever go back. I mean, I wasn't motivated to do so, but it would have been very hard to have gone backwards. We would have had to have written a whole bunch of boilerplate code that nobody had any interest in writing. And so there it was. And as I said, I've never really felt any reason to change it. To me, being open source has only brought good things. It's given us access to libraries, which means technology that certainly for a very long time we could never have afforded to pay license fees for. And in some cases, technology that is actually better than anything that we could have paid a license fee for. So, and it's gotten a bunch of people involved. I mean, I think our contributor list is somewhere between 50 and 80 people. I'm not quite sure where it stands right now.
Right.
I don't think we would have gotten 5 people involved had this been a closed source project.
Yeah. And and that leads us into a question that Pete had brought up, and I'll hand this over to Pete in regards to how you actually manage the contributions.
Right. Yeah, I was curious with an open source project of this size. Do you have a central group that you're using to kind of manage the direction of the product, or are you directing it, or like how does that part work?
So right now, I mean, it's actually curious. I went back and listened to your interview with Justin Frankel of Reaper. And it's actually very curious, how many parallels there really are between Reaper's development and Ardour's. I want to stress that Reaper started after Ardour. And in fact, Justin came and talked to us before he began work on Reaper.
Right. Okay.
But there have been periods of time during Ardour's history when we've had as many as 5 or 6 active developers. But for the most part, there are, I would say, 2 to 2.5 active developers. And by half, what I'm really referring to is there's some combination of 1 to 3 people who are putting in about one full person's amount of work,
right?
On a regular basis. So that's sort of the scope of the development team. As far as the direction and the planning, again, I think back to what Justin was saying when he talked about Reaper. I mean, we are very much driven by what we want to do. We are listening to users all the time in terms of feedback, in terms of what's broken and, what's not broken, what's awesome, what would be better if it did this or if it did that. But, for the most part, we want to work on things that we want to work on.
Right.
And because it's open source and because until relatively recently, there was really no money flowing to anyone but me, I didn't feel comfortable being in a position to ever tell somebody else, oh, well, no, you shouldn't be working on that. Or, please, can you work on this? If somebody had an itch, then they scratched it. And if the result of them scratching was well-structured code and, followed the overall, what can I say? I mean, coding rules and design principles and so on, then we would use it.
So much more organic growth to the product,
yes,
as opposed to like some directed long-term.
Yeah. Then the other important, I'd say, sort of global characteristic was much more, I think it was very important early on, is I deliberately went for breadth first, not depth first. I just want to actually rewind a little bit here to talk about another reason I wanted to write Ardour, which is that if you look at the software world, I mean, even in the late 1990s, if you wanted to write a text editor or a web browser or a spreadsheet or there was a whole bunch of categories of software where if you wanted to write one of those things from scratch, you could go and find examples of how to do it, and you could read the source code and figure out how it was done. There was nothing like that for a digital audio workstation. And I remember saying to lots of people in the early parts of Ardour, and I still say it now occasionally, there's a part of me, I don't even really care if Ardour succeeds as an actual application in the field. One of the things I care about a lot is, well, at least there's an example, right? When somebody else comes along, and there have been other people who come along, including Justin, and they decide they want to start writing a DAW, even if they look at our code and say, what a bunch of complete garbage, they get something to start from, to start thinking about, what are the issues and how do you do it? And because I didn't have any examples, to base anything on, I decided to go breadth first, not depth first. And what I mean by that is I tried to throw in as much as I could as early as possible to try to make sure that the basic software architecture was going to support all the things that we were going to need. There would have been an option to just say, oh, well, let's create like a very scaled down thing that does, 4 things really, really well. I mentioned earlier that, the very first version of the program was just recording and playback. You could have just focused on that and said, oh, well, we're actually not going to do the editing bit. But I felt fairly strongly that if we do that and then we add editing much later, we're suddenly going to find that the whole architecture is broken, and they can't support it. And so certainly for the first 10 years or so, it was always in my mind that this needs to be breadth first, right? Always think about what the full scope of the project is. Try to drop a little bit of something in there that relates to all these features so that you can get a solid feeling that, this will probably work. We won't have to redesign it and re-implement lots of it. But yes, very organic, very much driven by what itches people have and what itches people want to scratch. And I think that didn't really change until later in the 2000s when there started to be some collaborations with some existing companies.
Yeah.
I think that early approach you were talking about there, so let's just stop here for a second. What a great gift back to the community to approach it that way and to make sure that other people had references they could go by. Because it's exactly like you said, there were no examples. And really even today, except for, a couple, there are no great examples of how to do any of the types of things that you're talking about. Yeah.
I mean, there have been audiophile editors floating around, but, as I mentioned earlier, SND, one of the most capable ones around, for example, does all of its disk I/O in the main thread. It's a completely impossible design if you want to do multi-channel recording. So, that was a very important element, especially early on when, I didn't really know how successful things would be. And, perhaps the whole thing was going to crash and burn and not really go anywhere. Well, there'd at least be this body of source code that people could go back to and say, I think I heard about this project once that tried to do this. Let's go and see and actually see what they did.
Yeah. Well, I mean, look, and also with that whole approach, you were up against it very early on because you chose to do it on Linux. Now, we had, in our pre-discussion last week, we were discussing some of the other alternative operating systems apart from Mac and Windows, and the discussion came up about BIOS. And I remember having a very animated discussion. We'll say it was animated with the guys at the BIOS stand at NAMM in the year 2000, and I'd already written an article for the operation that I was working for in the late 90s, and I was a music tech guy there, and the article was Bits, Bytes, BIOS and Beyond, and I was the whole crux of the article was about both Steinberg and eMagic having an internal BIOS program, and so they had Nuendo and Logic respectively working on the BIOS OS, and I thought, this is it. This is going to be the game changer. The operating system then was far advanced of anything else in regards to real-time multi-threading, and it was just perfect for the application. And then they did this turnaround and said, oh, no, we're not going to be focusing on the professional audio. We're going to be focusing more on web design or something. It was something to do with the web. This is again, this is in late 99, 2000. It would have been 99 when they announced that. So, you know, the eMagic and the Stonebird program vaporized, and I saw them set up at the NAMM show down in the basement, and so I went up and gave them a few of my thoughts, which was quite entertaining. And the fellas are just looking at me in a state of shock, going, "Why are you so angry about essentially an operating system, or, you know, our shift in direction for the operating system?" I've gone, you guys don't get it. You had it in front of you. And so I'm trying to, you know, get my point across. And in the end, they gave me a couple of BIOS badges and told me to fuck off, essentially. They just didn't want to talk to me. I've still got those BIOS badges.
Well, yeah, I mean, I had similar interactions at NAMM. I'm not quite sure which year it was, probably 2001, 2002 maybe. And I mean, you know, it's easy to be smug in hindsight, but I am going to be smug. And I told them, and I said I told them all that they were hitching their wagons to the wrong horse. You know, I knew what everybody thought BIOS was capable of, but the problem was those guys didn't know anything about Linux. You know, BIOS existed as another proprietary commercial operating system that was headed by a guy who used to work at Apple. Yep. And it was exactly the sort of thing that the industry, because the industry was pretty, I mean, there was a lot of agitation at that point. People wanted to try to find something else to hitch themselves to. And, you know, BIOS looked like the right kind of thing. And Linux looked like, what the hell is this? Well, what are you talking about? What are you talking about open source? What are you talking about that there's no company behind it? What are you talking about that there's a bunch of hackers around the world that work on it? The problem was that even in 2001, Linux's real-time audio performance was better than BIOS, and it was better than OS X, and it was way better than Windows. Yep. And people didn't know this. They didn't understand this. In some cases, they wouldn't even believe that it was true. And yeah, I mean, how unfortunate it is in retrospect, I'm not sure. I think one of the things that's always irked me in this industry, irked is maybe too strong of a word. It's just, it's an observation that it is really, frankly, insane, and everybody in the industry knows that it is insane, that people are trying to use Windows and Mac OS computers to do professional audio on. And it's become a little less insane as the years have gone on. And occasionally it gets momentarily more insane and then goes back to less insane again with each release cycle and so on. But there's this fundamental problem that, you know, consumers already have a computer. They have a computer for other stuff. And when our industry started to release software that would run on a Windows machine or on what was Mac OS, and then it was OS X, and then it was Mac OS again, on one of those machines, they made a statement to consumers like, yeah, you don't have to get another computer for this. This is something you can just do on your regular computer. And it set up a bunch of expectations so that when in the early 2000s, when I think the industry was at a point of really, I think there were a lot of people talking fairly seriously about we have to get out from under the thumb of Microsoft and Apple. But you were never going to succeed at doing that because the consumer expectations were very clear, which is I should be able to do this on my existing computer. What are you telling me I have to buy a music computer for? You know? And so I think even if everybody had jumped on BIOS, and even if they had jumped on Linux, to be really honest, I think consumers wouldn't have gone down that path. If you look even today, you know, you've got companies like Ableton and Native Instruments making increasingly powerful music-making machines that have computers inside them, right? You've got Push 2, there's various Native Instruments devices, but, you know, all the machine series in particular. And, you know, they still do not want to market those. I mean, they're nudging around the edges, like maybe you don't need to actually open your laptop lid, right? There's these hints that maybe you should be using this instead of your computer or something, or with your computer, or it's a bias. But the overriding message is still like you don't need to have a special piece of hardware to do this stuff with.
Right.
And I would say that almost everybody who knows anything about the nitty-gritty details knows that you do have to have a special piece of hardware, even if It's just a very specially built Windows computer. Right. And so I actually think that, I mean, I would have loved it if I'd have convinced, you know, a bunch of companies back then to like jump ship, or not jump ship necessarily, but start supporting Linux. But I think in retrospect, I just don't think it would have gotten traction with consumers.
No. Well, look, BIOS got a bit of a foothold. You know, Tascam did that. I can't remember that. They had that big hardware hard disk recorder with a mixing console. I can't remember the name of it, but that was running on BIOS.
Yeah, Harrison consoles used to run BIOS internally.
Yeah, and the Radar
ran BIOS as well.
Ran BIOS as well. So they were pretty much the ones that the only ones that I knew that actually got a bit of a foothold.
Poor old Radar.
Yes. Well, and there's a whole stack of hardware out there that's got Linux under the bonnet that people just don't know. Digital consoles and mixing desks, mate, they're all running Linux, but people are just totally unaware of it, you know. So
absolutely, and I think that's how it would have gone. You know, that's how things would have gone even if they'd have switched much earlier or started using it much earlier. I don't think you'd have ended up with people carrying around a dedicated, you know, music machine laptop or music machine, you know, small ITX style box or something. But just because I just don't think consumers are into that idea. It means spending more money and they don't understand why they need a special machine. Yeah.
Well, look, the interesting aspect of that is, you know, my whole approach to the way that I deploy my DAWs for my Windows clients is I say to them, approach it like an embedded machine. And they're kind of looking at me going, what are you talking about? I said, just approach it like an embedded machine. Yes, you can go on the internet. Yes, you can browse with it. Yes, you can check your email if you need to. But if you approach this machine as a dedicated tool for your audio production and your musical composition, we're going to have an easier time of it. So, you know, I've had clients over the last 2.5 decades that, like in the early 2000s, I didn't even have the network enabled. I had the machines that highly optimized that network adapters giving us a few points on the DPC latency. We're dumping that out, and that was back in the day where there wasn't a need to be connected to the web for product activation and stuff. Now, obviously that's changed now. But I still approach these machines as dedicated. I preferred to approach them as dedicated audio machines, almost embedded. We'll say almost embedded. I'm doing quote marks, almost embedded. And I still navigate support stuff where people have bypassed my lockdowns, and you know they've had a friend over that said, "Oh no, you've got to update this and update your drivers for this and that and everything else," and the machines have just fallen over in a heap. And then I get the desperate call, and here I am doing a remote login, trying to reverse engineer what they've done to kill it. And in the end, 9 times out of 10, I've gone, and I don't like doing this, but I've gone, we need to re-image it back to my core optimized image, and we'll start again. So even this week, I had a call from a client. Their operation has stacks of machines in the internal network. They have a separate third-party IT department that handles all of the regular machines. And so the audio systems have to be included into that intranet. And so the IT guys go in there and it's essentially reverse pretty much everything that I've done to optimize these things. And I literally got a message from the owner saying, hey, Vin, there's something going on with that last machine that you built 6 months ago. It's taking, wait for this, 10 minutes to boot. I've gone, 10 minutes to boot? What? And I'm thinking, well, how long's it been doing this? They're going, oh, look, sometimes it takes about 10 minutes before it settles enough so that we can open our Cubase and do some work. And then sometimes we have to reboot it 3 times for it to get to that point. I've gone, well, that's ridiculous. Get it to me. So they're local in Melbourne. So they drop it off. I put it on the bench. It's removed from their environment. It boots in literally to the desktop in about 3 seconds. So you see the BIOS screen, it comes up into the login screen, bang, it's in. Let's say 10 seconds. I've gone 10 minutes. What? I'm still trying to figure out what they've done. And a couple of emails back and forward, I still don't know, but it has absolutely nothing to do with the system configuration or anything else. It is something to do with their internet. Oh, not the internet, their local networking and stuff. But this is the type of stuff that I encounter with the IT guys saying to me, "Oh, Vin, there's nothing to worry about. It's completely updated and upgraded to the latest version of Windows, and all the drivers have been updated." And I went, "Do you actually think that is comforting to me?" It isn't, because I have no idea what you've done with it. So that's the type of stuff. But I get, sorry, go Pete.
And I say, and really, Vin, like going back to what Paul was saying here, like the fewer things that a system has to do, like if you can scope that way down to, like you're saying, treating it almost like an embedded device, then the more you can optimize it and the faster it'll be.
Yes.
And the ultimate expression of that is all these like embedded Linux systems inside synth workstations and stuff.
Yeah, and I think I've actually been a little, I don't know what the right word is, chastened or saddened, because I think back in, I don't know, like the mid to late 2000s, one of the things I thought was going to be true of Linux was that actually you wouldn't have to deal with all the stuff you've just been talking about. That the overall design of the operating system was just so much better that it wasn't going to be an issue. But what I didn't understand was that I didn't understand the role that hardware was going to end up playing. And in many senses, that's just gotten worse, as the years have gone by. When you have, situations where it probably hasn't been as bad for a while now, but, it used to be the standard thing. Like, well, you've got the wrong video card. Like you can't use that video card and get low latency or audio. Right. Or, a more recent thing, Wi-Fi adapters. There's some Wi-Fi adapters that they will just hog the PCI bus for too long, and there's nothing the operating system can do about it. It's not even the device driver. No. And I didn't really anticipate how much of an issue that sort of thing was going to be, and now we're at this, I don't know what it is. It's an unfortunate situation where if you're going to run on generic, I say generic, no, let's just say you can either run on an Apple machine that they built, handpicked all the parts for, and sort of mostly control the supply chain and know that with very few exceptions, it's just going to work. Or you can buy something from Vin, or a similar system, which kind of has the same properties, or you're just taking a crapshoot. Right. And it used to be the case. I mean, I know Harrison had this problem a lot when they were in the era when they ran Opterons in their mixing consoles. That even a motherboard with the same product ID, they would change the chipset.
Yep.
And so, you bought 25 of them before and everything was cool. And then you buy the next batch and they're not working as well. And so, although I'm still a fervent believer and will stand up any day for the technical qualities of the Linux kernel, the reality is that on the ground, if somebody just goes out and buys a computer and they install Linux and they run Ardour, how well will it work? I have no idea.
Right. I tell people all the time that it's really easy to build a PC to use for general stuff. Like these days it's super simple. But getting one optimized, or like getting the right parts to be able to build something that works well for DAW, that takes a lot more research.
Yeah. And a lot of the time it's actually very difficult to do the research, right? I mean, it's not like the information is floating around.
Right. Nobody publishes this information.
No. And as I said, you even get chipset changes without product ID changes, which are the death of even doing excellent research.
Yep. And look, a lot of the information gets collated and pooled in a few forums, and I monitor those. Let's build an audio PC thread. And Pete can vouch. I barely participate because there's a couple of contributors on those threads, and look, they're extremely valuable to a lot of the guys on the forums. But some of them are not even audio engineers, or they don't even do the audio. They're basically computer tech guys. All right, so they don't have a fundamental understanding of just the most basic requirements when it comes to how are we going to get this system running in a mission-critical environment, and what particular changes, how easily can this stuff be tripped up? So, I don't want to make it sound like it's so volatile that you do a Windows update and everything breaks. That's not the case. But there has been, various Windows updates that have cause some chaos. Driver
maybe
updates,
a problem or two, yeah.
Yeah, driver updates that have caused some chaos as well. So you just have to be a little bit on top of it, more so. Look, Apple is not innocent here either. They've made some changes where they literally broke every USB interface there for a while. I mean, not one interface, all USB interfaces. So
no, and it's still widely known. I mean, within the Ardour community, there's a well-known bit of semi-folklore that I believe is still true on every other Apple machine, which is it matters which USB port you plug your interface into. Yeah. And when you try to explain that to people, and their eyes just roll. It's frustrating. But let's stop talking about hardware, because I prefer to talk about software.
Yeah. Okay. Well, and look, again, just real quickly, that's the same on PCs as well, because the USB ports are grouped in buses and all the rest of it. So you've got to be a little bit aware of what you're plugging into and what wants to be the master of that particular bus, and et cetera, et cetera.
So like Vin, the motherboards that have like a separate USB hub basically on the motherboard itself, and they don't really tell you.
Yeah, multiple, not one, multiple,
Yeah.
So just quickly, we can swing back to, I just want to switch back to Linux very quickly, and why my uptake of it in the early days probably wasn't as rapid was that, mate, I'm not a code guy, and I hate command line. So if I had to drop to a command line to install something on Linux, my eyes were rolling. I was struggling. So the thing that really significantly changed my enjoyment in Linux was Ubuntu, in that approach where they had that, the application, the software repository, and it made it easy to install basic applications, whether it was a browser or it was a DAW, it was an audio editor, a music player, whatever. I didn't have to drop to a command line to install it. So to me, that was a bit of a paradigm shift, because I really liked Ubuntu. It dragged me in. And I've been using Ubuntu since then. On all of my laptops around the house are all running Ubuntu. And I've tried other distributions as well. So my question to you, Paul, is, one, do you have a particular Linux distribution that you prefer using? And what was your overall feeling of that whole shift with Ubuntu? Because a lot of the other distributions nowadays are actually using that repository as a back end, or they use Ubuntu as an underlying back end. So
I try really hard to stay out of distribution wars.
Yeah.
When I was at Amazon and we used Linux there, we used Slackware, which is more or less the first, sort of package distribution version of Linux.
Mm-hmm.
I got that on 5 1/4-inch floppies way back from Boston Computer Society. Yep.
Yeah, that was the one. When I started working, when I started to work on audio and MIDI software, I was using Red Hat for no particular reason other than that, they had a good presence in the Linux open source world at that point. And for the last, I don't know how many years, 8 to 10 years, I've been using Debian. But I don't have any particular attachment to any of these things. I don't even remember why I switched from Red Hat to Debian. I think actually a lot of it may have been the other main core developer of Ardour is at least a little bit passionate about using Debian. And, there were some things that would come up from time to time where it just made more sense for us both to be using the same distribution. And I didn't really care, so I just switched. Mm-hmm. I think in general, it's, to me, it generally seems like a waste of time to get involved in those things. But I'm talking as somebody who's been using Linux for more than 30 years. I've been using Unix operating systems of various kinds for more than 30 years. And so, I have a handle on things that an awful lot of people who are coming to Linux in the relatively recent past, they're just not going to have. And it is going to make more of a difference to them what the look and feel, what that initial user experience is like. Whereas to me, it's just like, I don't really care. It's basically all the same from my perspective.
Yeah.
Also, I think that for people who want to do pro audio and music creation work on computers, really the only real question to ask in a Linux context is how much extra work do I have to do beyond the install?
Yes.
Any of them can be made to work. I mean, it ultimately mostly comes down to the hardware, which we were just talking about, and which kernel version that you have. And there's nearly always the right kernel version available. And so all the rest of it in terms of window management and exactly how you log in and exactly what the name of the tool is to install packages, none of that stuff matters, to that workflow. But you may have to do a bunch of things after you're done with your Linux install that if you used a different distribution, that they would have been done for you.
Yes, right.
And that's really for people who want to use DAWs on Linux. It's that extra bit of work that is to me, if there's any distinction between the distributions, that's the one.
Right.
And so, for example, Arch, which I've never used, as far as I can tell from the people that use Arch does an outstanding job of making all this stuff just work.
Right. Okay.
Similarly, there's an excellent distribution for people who want to get into music creation and pro audio on Linux, which is called AV Linux, which is put together by one guy up in, I'm going to forget which province. He's up in Canada. And, it's great. It's a stripped down, bare bones thing that is just for AV stuff.
Right.
And if you install that, it's done. There's no tweaking afterwards. It's all done, just the way that it is supposed to be. If you contrast that to, for example, installing Debian, right now, if you put Debian on after you're done with installing Debian, you're going to have to do a few things probably to like tweak the system a bit. And, for some people that's perfectly okay. And for some people it's like, I don't want to have to do this.
Yep. So, and that's probably similar, those distributions you just mentioned there, probably similar to approach to the original Ubuntu Studio back in the day.
Yeah. Ubuntu Studio was one of the first ones to try to say, let's do a distribution that is totally focused on audiovisual production workflows, and let's try to make it work the way it should work right out of the box, so that people don't have to do anything. And it was a good attempt. It's just that they didn't really have a long-term model for how to keep it going. But it was a great attempt.
Mm.
Yeah, the challenge is always that the musician community is highly influential, but it's pretty small compared to a lot of the other communities that these distributions have to service.
Yeah.
Yeah, it really is. And I think it's actually been really handy in the computing world that, what is the full name for it? I guess high frequency trading has become such a feature of our modern world. Whether you like high frequency trading or not, they are the people who are pushing computing to make sure that you can do low latency stuff.
Right.
We might all want to think that it's musicians and audio and, our latencies are so much lower. Well, they're not. Okay. The high frequency trading guys now are down in insane territory. And I've read stories, for example, that when SMIs first got introduced, system management interrupts, there was talk at Intel of making them completely unmaskable. And, you know, various people in small little niche wars like ours went and complained about this, and Intel basically just said, who are you? And then Wall Street went to see them and said, guys, we can't deal with this. Like, you have to be able to turn these interrupts off. And Intel was just like, we're on it.
Yeah.
And so, you know, it's actually very useful that there is another, you know, extremely high value. I'm not exactly going to say high profile, but there's a very high value economic sector that needs a lot of the same stuff that we need out of our computers. And we don't have to like what they do or be a part of it, or maybe we love what they do and we are a part of it. It doesn't really matter. They're acting as our advocates too, even if they don't know it, which is quite useful.
Yep. Now, one thing that I do want to ask you, Paul, is, you know, the ongoing challenges with running a DAW on Linux, and so it's all well and good to have the DAW application running well. The market is driven a lot by third-party plugins and virtual instruments, and then we start dealing with plugin formats, and also we can talk about the low latency driver protocols on Linux as well, which is you know, based on I think is Elsa, and then you've got Jack, which you actually developed, and there was the other competing one which I've forgotten about. Can you just give us your overall thoughts on that whole third-party development area in regards to the plugins and the low latency driver areas?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, you know, everybody in this world, it's interesting. Whenever I either listen to or actually have personal conversations with other DAW developers, the one thing that we all agree on is that if we could possibly just ban plugins, we would all do it.
Okay.
I have talked to the lead guys at many of the major DAWs, and we all agree, like, you know, if there was just some way to just say no plugins, then we would do it. But we all know that we all know that's not possible.
Yeah, Propellerhead did that for a while, and they caved. They eventually caved. Yeah.
Users want plugins. Plugin developers want plugins, and so they're here to stay. And it has been the case, you know, from the beginning of doing any kind of audio on Linux, which I think the first time there was audio I/O on Linux goes back to sometime in the I don't know, like the late 80s or very early 90s. I think it was the first time a driver was written. It's been clearly the case that plugin developers are not present on Linux. So there are sort of, I don't know, there's been sort of parallel overlapping stories here. We developed, I say we being a community of people doing Linux audio software, we developed our own very simple plugin standard back in the early 2000s. And that was useful for Linux people, at least, because there were a few guys around who cooked up hundreds of plugins using that simple plugin API. That was called LADSPA, the Linux Audio Developers Simple Plugin API.
Right.
It had the unique feature to it that there's no GUI.
Oh.
So, you know, if you are a plugin developer writing for that API, you don't write a GUI, okay? It doesn't exist. But, you know, that didn't convince Isotope to port any of their plugins to LADSPA. And so, you know, people started looking around at VST, and there's a guy in Norway, Ketil Mathusen, who figured out a way to use Wine, which is not a Windows emulator. That is, of course, a recursive acronym joke. Wine is a Windows emulator, but they don't want to be thought of as a Windows emulator. Right. Anyway, he figured out a way to use Wine, which you could use to run Windows programs on Linux, to use Wine to actually run plugins. Myself and another developer in Germany, Torben Hohn, took his work and tweaked it a bit so that you could actually use it not to run plugins in their own process, but to actually run them inside of a DAW. And for very long time, there was a version of Ardour. You could build a version of Ardour that would do that. So you would be running on Linux, but you could load Windows VST plugins.
That's impressive.
But it was really fun to do it. It was like, wow, the depths you have to go down to and the heights. Going down to register function call assumptions that vary in Windows and Linux and stuff like that, and going all the way up to sort of weird GUI stuff with the event loops and everything. It was great. It was a lot of fun, but it became clear that it was really impractical doing it in the particular way that we did in that version of Ardour, because you become completely dependent on Wine. And Wine is an amazing project, but it keeps changing. And what would happen is, they wouldn't ever change it so that it broke Excel, but they would change it so that it broke your favorite synth plugin and not the other one.
Finn, this sounds familiar.
Yeah.
So if you built up a workflow based on that idea, what was going to happen is, you would upgrade Wine so that you could run that new version of Contact. And all of a sudden, your Delay Llama plugin, no longer works correctly.
Breaking everything like else.
That. Yeah. So it just became clear that wasn't really a viable option in general. So two things then happened in sort of the development of how this works. First of all, people did start to create plugins in the VST2 format for Linux.
Oh, okay.
And there weren't many of them, but there were some. And a couple of them were developers who had done things for other platforms, previously. So we began to see a little trickle in of, a few commercial or proprietary plugins. In fact, I think the early ones weren't commercial proprietary, but they were, nobody on Windows ever even asked me for the source code guys, and they bought out versions for Linux.
Right.
So that was one strand. The second strand was that people started figuring out ways to do the Wine thing in an external process, and then essentially like a bridge. In the same way that you've got these 32, 64-bit
plugin bridges
these days.
JBridge and
yeah, it was the same kind of design where instead of having the dependency on Wine be in the DAW, this other thing would end up exposing your Windows VST plugins on Linux as if they were a Linux native plugin. And, that's been handy, and the technology behind that and the implementations have gotten better and better. There's one now with the incredibly unmemorable name of YARBridge. I don't know why it's called YARBridge, but anyway, that seems to be the one that works the best. And that will run almost any Windows VST plugin on Linux. However, it's still our advice to people that if your workflow is so dependent on your Windows plugins, then you should run Windows. If you really, really need to have that plugin and you can't function without it, don't move to a platform that plugin was not written for. It just doesn't really make any sense.
Yeah, correct.
In the meantime, there have been two other developments. One was the second version of the Linux native plugin API I mentioned, which is called LV2.
Yep.
That does have a way for the plugins to provide a user interface, a GUI, and it has lots of other really cool features. And in a minute, I might back up to a cool industry story that you guys may or may not know about that. But the other thing that's happened very recently, relatively recently, of course, is that VST3 came out. And Steinberg, bless their tiny little hearts, finally, acknowledged, first of all, that your plugin API probably should allow for open source plugins, which the VST2 licensing did not allow. And secondly, they actually made it so that it would actually work on Linux without much modification. And so in the last year and a half, we have seen a slow but steady trickle of commercial plugin developers releasing their stuff for Linux. I would say, to me, the most significant is probably Yuhi.
Oh, yes.
All of their synths are available for Linux.
Nice.
But there then there's a growing number of other guys out there who are bringing stuff out in VST3 because it's easy to do. The other big hero in this story is Juice. So an awful lot of plugin developers these days use the Juice toolkit to do all of their plugin development. And guess what? You just tick a box in some Juice IDE configuration thing, and you can get a Linux native plugin out of it.
Yeah.
Very nice.
How cool is that?
Very good.
That's resulted in, I mean, obviously they're not all doing it. You still can't get Isotope. You still can't get Waves, even though Waves actually has all of their stuff. All of their plugins will run on Linux.
But with Waves, they don't actually have native plugins. They're all running through a wave shell. They're all essentially bridged.
Yes and no. I mean, it's not really bridged. The Wave shell was a part of the VST spec that Steinberg added for Waves,
right?
At their behest, and they're not. What Waves does, I don't know how much I'm allowed to say about this because I've collaborated with Waves quite a lot. Basically, they're not bridged in the way that you're thinking.
A traditional bridge, right? Yeah.
Yeah, Waves is more like Juice, actually. Waves development process in the sense that if you write a plugin with Juice, right, at some point you get to write a bunch of the DSP code. And then at some point you write some GUI code. And then you use some automatic stuff in Juice to just say, I need a VST plugin, or I need an audio unit, or I need AAX. Mm-hmm. And Juice does the rest of that stuff, and it wraps the code that you wrote in whatever is needed to turn that into a VST plugin or something else.
Right.
And Waves has their own similar thing in-house. They've got their own internal thing that they use to sort of write DSP code and do all that kind of thing. And then they can press a button and say, now we need that as a VST3, or we need that as an audio unit.
And that's the shell. That's the shell itself, right?
No, that's not the shell.
Right.
So the shell is something different. So the shell, I still don't really know why they use the shell, but the shell is a weird VST mechanism that lets all the plugins be packaged as one, and then the shell is what you end up with is this shell plugin that sees all the others.
Correct.
And technically, I mean, in all the conversations I've had with those guys, I never understood really what it was for.
Right.
My gut feeling was it had more to do with licensing arrangements than it did to do with anything on the level of plugin architecture and stuff like that.
Okay.
So to go back to the story, people are coming to the platform now with VST3 plugins that are native for Linux. The suite of LV2 plugins that are available, again, Juice will generate LV2 format plugins as well, so that's an option for developers now. Between the two of those worlds, each passing month just sees more and more cool, powerful, awesome plugins emerging for Linux that are native. Now, it's still the case that if you really like Isotope's denoising stuff, or you really like Contact as your sample playback engine, and who doesn't, right? Because it's really the only one out there. Those things are out of reach right now, and then you have to make a choice. Do I try to use one of the wine-based bridges, or do I just go back to Windows?
Go back to Windows, yeah, sure.
But it is definitely the case that, and I would say somebody who's new to all this stuff, like if you're a 15-year-old, 16-year-old kid, and you just started doing music production or recording on whatever subset is, and you don't have these attachments yet, you are going to be able to do everything with Linux native plugins. The results are not always going to be as good. Yeah, we don't have noise reduction that is as good as Isotopes. We don't have a sample playback engine that has the number of libraries that Contact does. But the tools are out there, and you don't need to. You will not be saying, "Oh my God, I can't get my hands on a linear parametric EQ." Right, it's there now. You might think it's not as good as your preferred parametric EQ on Windows, but then somebody else thinks that the one that you like isn't that good either. So that's where you get back down to the subjective realm.
Yeah, of course.
So in the plugin world, yes, the situation is not as good as it is on Windows, where almost anybody who ever creates a plugin, they release it for Windows. It's not as good as it is on the Mac, where just slightly fewer people always release it as an audio unit. But the situation is not bad, and it gets better all the time. And I think particularly as more and more people are switching towards Juice as their development infrastructure for plugins, the more and more of those guys I think we'll be seeing who just say, well, what the hell? There was a button for the Linux version. Why don't I do that?
Yeah, no, of course.
So that's what's going on the plugin front. So now let me just talk about the low latency thing, and then you can ask some questions if you have them.
Yep.
So the situation on Linux is much less like Windows and much more like Mac OS.
Right.
There is fundamentally just one audio driver framework on the platform, and that's ALSA, which you mentioned earlier.
Yep.
And essentially, all audio I/O goes through ALSA. And ALSA is as capable of doing low latency as any other driver framework as you can name, and a lot more capable than some of them. The differences are not as great as they were in the mid-2000s when ALSA was far ahead of anything on Windows and was a little bit better than Core Audio. Now it's at the point where, I think you should consider the best possible performance on all those platforms to be about the same, right? And it's going to vary a little bit just depending on what audio interface that you use and the exact hardware that you're using and so on. But fundamentally, there's nothing about the software that is going to get in the way. So ALSA is the basic thing there. But then there's a question of, okay, so somebody writes some software to do audio I/O, what do they use? And on Mac OS, you've got this lovely scenario where for almost everyone, there's only one answer, which is you just use Core Audio. It's not quite that simple because Core Audio does present some APIs that are at different levels of simplicity. There's one that is targeting, I guess you could call it more like consumer or desktop applications. But, if you're writing the sort of stuff that we're talking about here today and that you talk about on the show, you're going to be using the lower levels of Core Audio, and that's it. That's the only choice, and it's going to work.
Yep.
If you're on Windows, then you might lose a big chunk of your hair while you try to figure out exactly which API you ought to use and which device drivers will support the API that you've decided to use and so on and so forth. But, there's options. In Linux world, for this type of software, there's only really two choices, which you either write stuff to talk directly to ALSA or you write stuff to talk to Jack. Jack doesn't add any latency. It chews up a tiny, almost immeasurable amount of CPU to add it to the mix. And what it gives you is the ability to route audio freely, have multiple applications all using the sound card, sending audio and MIDI to each other, and so on. So most of the applications on Linux in this sphere of applications generally tend to support both of those APIs. There's an option. Like in Ardour, for example, we have an ALSA backend that talks directly to ALSA, and we have a Jack backend that is still sending audio in and out ultimately through ALSA because that's the only way to do it. But it uses Jack as an intermediate.
As a front end, yeah.
And at this point in Ardour's life, we are slowly trying to remove, I wouldn't say remove references to Jack, but we generally encourage new users to not use it. And it's not because it's crap or doesn't work or has problems. It's because we've entered a time period where most of the new users, an awful lot of them, particularly the ones that ask for help, just I don't want to be too slanderous here. Let's just say they have a hard time understanding how to use Jack.
Yep.
Conceptually, it's a lot more involved than, I just started up my DAW and it's sending output to my, my Fireface or something. They have to deal with new concepts. They have to think about, wait, I can have another program and how do I do this or how do I do that? There's a whole different layer of connection management I could do. Well, that stuff's all really cool and is incredibly powerful, and I'm still quite proud of it. But for a lot of new users, it just ends up being really confusing.
Yeah, it's just another level of complexity that they need to get their head around. Yeah,
and for the most part, most of them don't need.
Look, there's some similar stuff there's some similar applications on Windows that I was attempting to use to get like some basic loop back this is when I was just doing some development work and how to actually do this podcast. And I've got to tell you, Paul, I'm a 25, 30-year veteran of this stuff, and I was deer in the headlights. I'm like, what the fuck? I can't work this stuff out. So I can imagine the new guys would be, it would be quite a challenge. And the other thing that I was finding was that I think I watched 10 different videos of, how-tos, and everyone did it differently. And then I just went, I can't work this out. And in the end, on my RME, stupid me, didn't, had missed the button. It said loop back. And then I went, oh, here we go. It was resolved. Okay. So look, I think what we should do is we should move on to the Ardour development itself. Now, one of the things that I found interesting when I was doing a little bit of back research for the show was your discussions on audio time versus musical time, because we've covered this a few times with some of the DAW developers. And one of the things that I noticed was depending on how old the core code is, right? So if we've got, we call them let's call them the heritage DAWs that started off in the 90s as MIDI sequences. So they were more focused on musical time, and then the audio engine was attached, and so they had the challenges there between going in that direction. But then we had things like Pro Tools that was an audio only application that then added MIDI. So the same challenge, but it was coming in the other direction between audio time and music time. Mm-hmm. Now with Ardour, was MIDI an integral part right at the start, or were you originally an audio only and then you added MIDI? And if so, can you tell us the challenges and how you actually overcame them?
So we were definitely audio only to start with.
Yep.
The idea of doing MIDI was obviously floating around in the air right from the start, since there were already plenty of MIDI sequences around on all platforms. And in fact, this also just points to another interesting part of our development process. We were the beneficiaries of several years of being part of Google's Summer of Code program, which is a very nice thing that Google did and still does, where they basically sponsor a student or very junior programmer for the whole summer to work on something. And I think we did 3 or 4 projects through Google Summer of Code. One of them was adding MIDI. And there was a guy called David Robillard who took that on. Now, David wasn't a novice at this stuff. He'd already been involved in Ardour to some extent. He was a computer science PhD candidate and knew lots of stuff. He added the basic framework for handling MIDI. I don't even remember quite what year that was, but sometime in the aughts, I think. And got paid to do it. Well, not much, but he got paid by Google to do that. And at that point in time, I think it's fair to say that none of us who were involved in the project really understood some of the complexities of this time stuff. David's work clearly had to recognize that there was this thing called musical time, that like MIDI typically doesn't get sequenced in units of samples. I mean, you could do it that way if you're doing Foley or effects work, I guess, where no, this note has to come in exactly when the door slams. That's not going to be related to tempo or meter or anything. But for the most part, it's music time. What we didn't really understand was the scope of the problems that would be caused by converting back and forth between those two, what I tend to call time domains. And so our early MIDI stuff certainly represented notes and everything. Well, the time of this it's on the 35th beat, right? And at some point in your engine, you have to convert what the 35th beat is into an actual sample time. because that's the point at which you're actually going to send that MIDI out to, well, it's either going to be delivered to a plugin or head out to some hardware. But we started realizing, I don't know, 8-9 years ago perhaps, that if you do this conversion back and forth, so you go from a musical time to an audio sample time and back to a musical time, that those conversions are lossy, right? You're not guaranteed. In fact, you're almost guaranteed not to end up back with exactly the same answer. And so that has been a source of, very long-lived, very irritating bugs in Ardour, because it's not completely deterministic at all, right? It depends whether this conversion, the two-way conversion, works. It depends on your tempo. It depends on your sample rate. It depends on what type of grid snapping you're using. And so sometimes everything is completely fine and nothing goes wrong. And sometimes the first note at the very beginning of a region won't play. And that's because the math ends up being one sample off and it thinks that the start of the note is not in the region.
Yep.
So this all comes from this back and forth. So to be clear, if you do everything in samples or you do everything in music time, no worries. But you can't do everything in one or the other. Right, the MIDI and music stuff in general has to be thought of in musical terms, and you want to edit in musical terms. Like, I want to move this whole thing down 4 bars. Right? What does that mean? Well, it means 4 bars.
Yeah.
Right. That's what the musician means. They don't mean anything else. They mean move it 4 bars. So you have to have both of them. And so it became clear to me several years ago that if we were ever going to get out of the realm of these irritating, non-deterministic, really, I said irritating already, just really irritating bugs. They happen to me, they happen to users. I understand that it is like the most maddening thing. They don't show up all the time, but when they show up, it's like, why is that note not playing? And then you go to our forums and somebody like me says, well, just trim the region by 1 sample, right? and the user's just like, what? Yeah. So in order to fix this, something more significant was going to need to be done. And to be honest, I still don't even know if what I've done is the right approach, but I've done it twice already. This is the second implementation that is a very deep dive and very deep, complicated implementation of ways of representing time that can either be audio sample-based or can be music-based. And if they're music-based and you do operations like move this down 4 bars, they stay music-based.
Right.
We do not convert to samples and then convert back to music time. So, if something was at the 12th bar and you move it down 5 bars, it's at the 17th bar now. There was no back and forth between these two domains. And that's something that we have referred to, there's been a lot of talk in the community as I've been working on it, and even in the code is called new tempo. And the whole goals of the new tempo effort are a little bit bigger than that, actually. We're going for a much more sophisticated tempo map that can have features in it that no other DAW has. So we're going to have, so for example, our bars, beats, and tick labels are completely arbitrary and you can repeat them. So one of the things we've heard from a lot of users is that, when they do things like band practice, they would like to be able to just say, look, bar 1, beat 1 start is right here. But that's for that song. Oh, and then we moved on to another song. Oh, and bar 1, beat 1 is right here.
Right, okay.
They don't want to be locked in to this notion that there's there. But also that means that you can actually put those bar and beat markers anywhere you want, or automated software could put them anywhere that you want. So we can actually have a tempo map that can completely follow actual performances rather than other DAWs have been doing that too, I know.
Yes, yeah.
So that's the full scope of the new tempo thing. But the timing thing primarily is a way of saying we have got to find a way to avoid converting in both directions. Now, I do know that some other DAWs have avoided this by using wall clock time for everything. And this is an interesting approach that I rejected, but I know that they carry on using. So some of them, for example, everything is timestamped in fractional seconds.
Right.
And they just deal with it I don't know exactly what they do. And like I said, if you move something down 4 bars, what does that actually mean? But that's the representation they've used that gets rid of this bidirectional conversion problem that we had.
Right.
But it does mean that when a user wants to do things in units of bars and beats, they have to do a bit more work to make sure that the right thing happens. And so far as I can tell, I mean, I merged, it was probably the biggest code merge that I've ever had to do in a project. I don't know how many months ago it was now, 3 or 4 months ago. I merged in what was basically 18 months worth of work back into the master branch of Ardour. And, there's been some glitches and things that aren't working quite right. But that's why it's a pre-alpha version, and we advise people not to use it for the moment.
And this is this the precursor to version 7, is it?
Yes, this is the precursor to version 7.
Right, yeah. And look, and that whole music time versus audio time, it's always fascinated me. I've been across it for many, many years. I've never really understood the under-bonnet mechanics, and most musicians don't. They don't really care. They just go, hang on, I need to put, like you said, I need to put this here, and I don't care what the under-bonnet mechanics is, just get it to work. But it is interesting that, and it is extremely complex. And I was in some of the interviews with some of the other DAW developers, the DAWs that come later. So let's just say they're not the legacy DAWs. These are the guys that come a bit later. Mm-hmm. And their approach and their whole opinion of MIDI was, I was actually taken back a little bit. They're going, oh, yeah, it's MIDI, or, it's an external instrument, talking traditional MIDI. And I'm like, you do know that there are a lot of people that still use hardware synthesizers.
Yeah. I mean, from my perspective, a lot of this timing stuff doesn't have a lot to do with MIDI per se. I mean, MIDI, does happen to, almost all MIDI files. I mean, MIDI files actually can be timestamped in units of video frames, but there's very few of those floating around. So, yes, it's true that they're very strongly connected. But even if you didn't have MIDI anywhere in your DAW, there's no MIDI in VST3 anymore, right? It doesn't exist as a concept. Right. You're still going to have to deal with musical time.
Yeah. Well, look, one thing that I discovered, I was doing a very early port of my DAWbench VI session to another DAW that isn't currently in my list. And when everything was running in audio time, was just, we were talking all audio and plugins, that session was perfect. Once we started dealing with the MIDI, I was in all manners of 3 levels of hell, because there was all of this phasing and shifting and pitch stuff going on. And I couldn't work. To this day, I still haven't worked it out. I do need to contact the developer again and go, what is going on here? And I even stripped it back to just the core 16 parts of a MIDI, 16 individual MIDI instances of contact, each running one part. I couldn't get this stuff to play. And I've gone, I've got to be doing something really wrong here. But I've never experienced it in any other, let's call them the legacy DAWs, that had, the original focus was on musical time. Now, Reaper was another one that came later, but I've never encountered that in Reaper as well. So whatever Justin did there was quite good.
The other issue with this stuff that I've noticed recently, and I'm still a little unsure about how we're going to deal with it, is that just go back to a little bit of sort of music performance theory for a moment. If you look at what's known about humans speeding up tempo in a band, the resulting curve that you get from that is actually exponential. Humans are not very good at counting absolute time like seconds, but if they're playing to a beat, then, for example, making the beat 3/4 the length it used to be and then 3/4 that length again and so on, good musicians are pretty capable of doing that.
Yes.
And if you imagine, I mean, the simplest case for me I always think about is halving the length of a beat each time that the beat happens. And that feels linear when you listen to it. This is a lot like acoustic volume at the human ear, right? What we hear as a linear gain fade is actually exponential. It's logarithmic actually. And similarly, if musicians slow down tempo or speed up tempo, what you hear as a linear speed up is actually exponential. And so in Ardour, we honor this, shall I say. Our tempo ramps are all exponential. But what we have been finding recently is there's a bunch of plugins that when we give them the tempo calculated from these exponential ramps, they can't deal with it.
Right.
Their belief is that tempo ramps are linear, and they do the math, and they sort of are saying like, wait, what? You just told me that the tempo was this, and now it's changed to this, but that doesn't fit with the way it was changing before. It's not linear. And this is a bit of a problem. We obviously can't fix the plugins, but those plugins are not actually honoring what humans actually do.
Yep.
They do not reduce the length of a beat by half a second. They reduce it by a length of half a beat. And so, I'm not quite sure how we're going to handle that, just because, there've been, I wouldn't say there's a lot, but I think that we know of at least a half a dozen plugins right now that will choke when we feed them these exponential tempo ramps.
Right. Okay.
Interesting.
Yeah, definitely. Now, just moving on from the audio time and music time, let's talk a little bit about your first foray into Windows. Was not until, I think, 2016. Was that version 5, Paul?
Yep.
And your work with some third-party companies. So you mentioned Waves before, and we also mentioned Harrison Mixbus. So can you give us a little bit of background with the work that you did with those two companies, and how Ardour was basically that was the core of their products? Yeah.
I'm gonna just slightly rewind and actually go back a bit earlier than that to 2006.
Right.
When I got this phone call in the middle of the day, and there was this British guy on the other end of the phone and said, "Is this Paul?" And I said, "Yeah." And he said, "Well, hi, this is Peter Gabriel."
Wow.
And I was like, "Oh, hi. Oh, hi, Peter. How are you?" And Gabriel had just purchased with some American dude. He just purchased Solid State Logic.
Right.
And, Gabriel, given his political inclinations and ideas about community, was interested in the idea of a, if you like, community-owned DAW. And Solid State Logic at that point, they didn't have a DAW. They had all of their hardware stuff, but they didn't have a DAW.
Didn't they? They did have a DAW at some point.
That came. They bought it after this incident that I'm telling you about. So, Solid State basically started paying me to work on the Mac, or what was then the OSX port of Ardour. And it was a very nice arrangement. I don't know what they really thought they would get out of it, and that was one of the problems that I think the company never came up with a good theory or an idea about what are we going to do with an open source software product. But before they even figured that out, they bought Soundscape.
That's right.
And they bought them mostly for the fact that company had reverse engineered the Pro Tools converters on the wire format.
Yes.
So that you could buy third-party hardware and still connect to Pro Tools. And that was what they really wanted. But the Soundscape guys gave them an ultimatum and basically said, like, if you try to drop our DAW, we're not going to work for you.
No. Right. Okay.
And so suddenly SSL went from having no DAWs to having 2 DAWs. And it was kind of obvious which one they were going to drop.
Right.
So, I wasn't really that pissed off. It had been a nice experience to go and visit with them and, get some feedback from them and stuff. And they did help to pay for someone to work on the Mac board. And there was then this weird period there where it wasn't really quite clear what was going to happen as far as the financials of Ardour. I had known the guys at Waves for quite a long time, met them at one of those NAMM trade shows where I was going around trying to convince people to use Linux.
Yep. And
they already knew about Linux and felt it was very sensible. And so I started doing a little bit of work for them after the SSL stuff happened. It didn't come to anything in the end, but it was sort of more of a research project. But at around the same time, Harrison had gotten in touch with me. I think I got the order of this right. I think actually, no, the Harrison stuff actually maybe predates the solid state one.
Oh.
There's a guy at Harrison called Ben Loftus who was really into the idea of Ardour right from the beginning. And unlike the guys at Solid State, he had a very clear idea of what their company could do with an open source product. Although we did a couple of other products that didn't really take off, the one that did take off for them is called Mixbus. And the key idea behind Mixbus, I think saying this in reverse, is what happens if you take a DAW. Let's just back up a little bit. If you look at any of the other DAWs, and particularly if you looked at them in, say, around 2010, shall we say, if you were used to working on a traditional console, working in the mixer of those DAWs is just a pain in the ass.
Very alien. Yep.
It's very alien. I mean, they don't have the busing set up properly. They don't, I have to go through and drop in all these plugins over here just to get what I had on my SSL or my Harrison or my Neve or whatever. I know that's changed a lot now. And I don't know the extent to which Mixbus is partly responsible for that. But anyway, at that point, if you were a console user, DAWs felt very alien. And Ben's key idea was, what happens if we take an open source DAW, we leverage the open source part of it, we maintain the open source part of it, we add our own DSP as a plugin, which doesn't need to be open source, and we use that DSP to re-engineer how the mixer works so that it functions like a console. Which means that, for example, that you get EQ and compression on every track by default. It means that you have tape saturation on the master bus by default. It's just there. It means that all your sends are already connected to all your all the mix buses. You don't have to create them; they're just there. And there's a knob, on the screen that corresponds to exactly that thing. So, I mean, I had no idea how successful that would be, but Ben thought that it would be a cool idea. And so, I've been collaborating with Harrison for a long time now. They're a great company to collaborate with. They've stayed very close to the source code of Ardour. And they also, in what has been a very fortuitous turn of events for everyone, they hired probably the most brilliant programmer who's been a part of the Ardour project, a guy called Robin Garius who lives in Berlin. They hire him and pay him to work on features.
Right.
But it's understood that he, for the most part, works on Ardour and then just ports that over to Mixbus. Robin does sometimes do work that is literally just for Mixbus as well, but that tends to be unusual.
Right.
And he's just an insanely brilliant programmer. I mean, he makes me feel incompetent most of the time. But so that got him on board, as a full-time developer, which has just been incredibly valuable. And, the collaboration between Ardour and Mixbus, I mean, we're two separate products, but we share almost the exact same code base. We try to make that be true.
Right.
And we have a lot of collaboration. I mean, I'm always in a weekly Monday meeting with those guys, and, we talk about stuff online all the time. So the Harrison thing was going on in the background, and then Waves stepped up. As I said, I'd already done a couple of projects for them that didn't end up really amounting to a lot, or convinced them to go in a different direction. So, for example, when they did, I'm sure both of you guys know about SoundGrid. The point where I was working on SoundGrid, they didn't really have a way to integrate SoundGrid with the DAW. They've subsequently gone down the path of adding plugins so you can just basically bridge out to SoundGrid and come back. But their initial idea was, wouldn't it be awesome if we could actually have really deep integration? And the only way we can do that is in a DAW where we have the source code. Well, let's talk to Paul again.
Yep.
And so I was doing work on that. But I think it just turned out, I think they concluded that the bridge plugin idea is actually good enough and it works everywhere. So they don't have to convince Digi to implement all this stuff. They can give their users a plugin.
Yeah.
But anyway, Waves had decided that they were going to try to get into the DAW market as well. And they also had a good concept that it didn't matter whether it was open source. They had recently dropped they were in the process of dropping their insane anti-hacking campaigns and stuff, and realizing that we just have to provide really good customer service, and that's why people will pay us for stuff. But it also had the brilliant idea of not trying to jump in the whole way. Now, you might say it wasn't so brilliant because PreSonus jumped in the whole way with Studio One. And it's true, and it's amazing and incredible, and I have a huge amount of respect for it. Wave's approach was like, we're not going to do a studio DAW to begin with. We want to produce a new product that will be focused on live front of house work. So no plugins, just recording, some other features that will be very specific for that kind of work. And they hired a small team of guys from Ukraine, and I went over and spent a month with those guys to get them up to speed on the code base and everything. And we got the product out. It was a very interesting experience working with a product manager and all this kind of stuff that Ardour just doesn't have.
Yep.
A guy who says, "Well, I don't actually care what you think. It has to work like this." But also quite interesting working with people who, even though they had been doing work for some other very large audio software companies, really didn't know anything about audio software.
Right.
So it was a very, very interesting experience, and the product came out, and my recollection was that I think Waves charged like $99 for it or something, and you could get the source code if you wanted it. And it was a moderate success. I think there were lots of good reviews for it. It went down quite well. But they decided, I don't know, maybe 6 months to a year after that they weren't going to carry on going down that path towards the Studio DAW.
Right.
I suspect maybe the emergence of Studio One, I know I never talked to him about it, but I would guess that may have had something to do with it.
Right. So how old is that? Sorry, how old is that Tracks Live software thing?
I don't actually know. I'm trying to think when I was working with them. Yeah, 2015.
Okay.
If you said the Windows version came out 2016, that would have been right around that time.
Okay. So it's around about 5 years ago. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Just because that was one of their goals. They wanted to have it. I mean, we ran on Linux and Mac at that point, and they wanted to have a Windows version too.
Right. So it was it's pretty short-lived then. Because I think you can still download it now for free.
Yes, it's still downloadable. And I have to say that one of my favorite Ardour stories, or being out in the field, I went to see, there's a guy called Niels Fram, who's a fairly successful like postmodern pianist, post-classical, I guess people call him. And I went to see him play in Philly at some point. And I was standing up in the balcony and looking down at his sound guy. I thought, wait a second, the sound guy's running Tracks Live.
Yeah.
And so I went down, after the gig was finished to talk to him about it, and said, how's this working for you? And he's like, oh, it's just perfect. I can't believe this software. I tried using all these other DAWs before, and this is exactly what I needed. It's so good. And I'm like, well, actually, I wrote that. It was a good feeling. But yeah, it didn't last too long. The other aspect to that story, and there's no bad blood between myself and Waves at all, but the actual that development process to me was really a culture shock. The guys they hired had, I'm not saying they're wrong at all, but let's just say there are very different ways that you develop software with GUIs.
Yes.
And these guys were very attached to one way that I would say is probably more common out in the world in general. But in Ardour, we don't do things that way at all. And so there was a lot of culture clash in terms of, just basic things. Like, they couldn't understand why you couldn't just change the appearance of the solo button by dropping in a different image file.
Right.
And it's like, well, in Ardour, we don't do the GUI that way at all. And if you do the image file thing, that doesn't scale to high DPI screens, right? you know, in the years since then, actually, I think most of the other DAWs have all realized the error of their ways. I mean, Fruity Loops, I know, had to do a massive change so that they could do high DPI because their whole interface was all based on image, you know, just sticking images in there.
You'll find most DAWs had a problem moving to the high DPI.
Exactly,
stuff.
exactly. Well, in Ardour, we never did that. All of our stuff has always been drawn in code.
Oh, you can scale it. Okay, yeah, perfect.
Yeah, it just scales. It just scales automatically.
Yep.
So the culture shock was a lot, and also they had one of the guys on that team. There was a younger guy that I got on with really well. There was an older guy who was a Russian. Was Valerie really Russian? Yeah, I guess. I can't remember if he was an older Russian guy or an older Ukrainian guy. But let's just say he was an older developer who had sort of grown up writing software under more the Russian type of concept of how you did software.
Yep.
And let's just say that, I mean, there's nothing, I'm not, again, casting judgment on it. It just doesn't fit in with like this kind of freewheeling, open source American software development model.
Yep.
And in fact, I would go back and just as a follow-up on that, when you were talking to Justin about Reaper and some of the development stuff there, and I think you were talking, Vin, about German companies.
Yes.
I mean, I have this weird friendship with Gerhard from Ableton, one of the founders, where we hardly ever see each other, hardly ever communicate. But when we do, we hang out in a restaurant. We're the first in and the last out.
Right.
And I know from talking to Gerhard that, you know, one of the issues in Europe is that a lot of companies over there feel obliged, actually they might even be legally obliged to follow ISO 9001 specs for software engineering.
Right.
And it tends to create a very much more rigid way of doing things. And if you come from, again, that's kind of particularly from the open source US freewheeling model, it can be a pretty tricky culture fit, you know?
Yep.
There's actually the guy I mentioned earlier, David Robillard, who did MIDI and Ardour originally. He went to work for Ableton for, I'm not sure quite how long he was there for, 18 months maybe. And I hope David wouldn't mind me saying that I think he found that too much of a culture shock.
Yep.
So yeah, the experience with Waves was really interesting, and you know, I love those guys. It was a great thing to do. It's too bad in a way that it didn't carry on down the path towards yet another DAW. But on the other hand, maybe the world is better without yet another DAW.
Yeah. There's still people trying to, you know, well, not trying. There's still people bringing out new DAWs.
Yeah.
There's a hardware audio interface manufacturer that decided to kind of recycle a lot of an early 90s DAW. I'm just being a little bit cryptic, but I think you know, I made the comment of you know, DigiDesign called and DigiDesign 1998 called and wants their DAW back. I know that's been a little bit facetious, but there's I don't think the world needs another DAW at the moment. That's just my personal opinion. Now, can we move on to, this is an area that, you know, is close to a lot of my work, and that is multi-core and multiprocessing performance, and especially, you know, in regards to how that's handled cross-platform. And I'm also going to ask the question of whether you guys encountered any of the MMCSS optimization problems in Windows.
Oh, Vin.
Sorry, mate.
Come up.
MMCSS Avenger. Call me that.
So let's start with my high-level answer, which is that I try to not care about this stuff at all. Mm-hmm. And one of the ways that we try to not care about it is that we try as little as possible to ever use platform-specific APIs.
Right.
Obviously, when it comes to things like audio I/O, there's not much choice there, at least if you want to do things efficiently. But for the rest of our software, we generally are trying to stay as far away from Windows APIs, Mac APIs, and in fact, to some extent, even very Linux-specific APIs as well. Mm-hmm.
But you'd have to be dealing with the task schedulings for those respective operating systems.
I'll get to that. So we are using POSIX APIs. POSIX is a standard specified by the International Electrical Engineering, something or others, blah, blah, blah. And it's sort of modeled mostly on the Unix system call APIs, but it includes a lot more than that. And so, for example, for threading, we are using pthreads, which is part of the POSIX spec. And, pthreads exists on pretty much any platform that you can name. And we just use pthreads and we make calls in pthreads, and pthreads does its stuff for us. It sets thread priorities and does all this other kind of work. So that's the theoretical picture, and that's how I think things ought to be. I would much rather go and hack on pthreads for Windows and fix it than change Ardour to not use pthreads and use a bunch of low-level Windows APIs.
Right.
Makes sense.
Because then everybody benefits from that. Suddenly pthreads can do what it does on the other platforms. But having said that, that's not actually the situation with respect to Windows right now. We do use pthreads, and that's the basic way that we create threads and we set priorities and so on. But back in, I looked at the code the other day, I think 2018, one of our Melbourne-based developers, in fact, went and added a bunch of code to use the MMCSS APIs. And it was actually a useful deep dive for me because I never bothered to look at that code again. I would prefer that code didn't even exist. But Tim added it just because there was evidence that it was a really good idea for us to be using it on Windows. Mm-hmm. But we don't really do a lot with it. And for the result of the deep dive, I actually think we are missing an entire call that we should be making, which is really intriguing. And I'll be doing some more collaboration and consulting with people in the next couple of weeks about that.
But you do understand that when you guys were first looking at it under Windows 7, there wasn't really any thread limitations. That got introduced in Windows 10. Right.
So we try to pay no attention to that. So going back, I listened to your discussion with Justin about this from a couple of years ago. Mm-hmm. And the story in Ardour is even simpler than the story in Reaper. We don't pay any attention to system limits at all. Mm-hmm. Ardour will create as many threads as the combination of the user preferences and the hardware tells us to create. We do not inquire about thread limits. We don't really pay attention to them. We probably would pay attention to them if we failed to create them. Mm-hmm. And we also don't pay any attention to logical cores either. So from what I could tell from your discussions online about the issues that came up with Steinberg and stuff, I almost want to wave my hands and say I don't even really know whether we ran into that. Our approach to it is so different in the sense that we basically say, give me a thread, set the priority, I don't care.
But you wouldn't have run into it unless you were running higher core systems. So it really depends on what type of, how many cores your development system was running. And when you said you don't deal with logical cores, are you saying that you're actually turning off hyperthreading when you're doing your development?
That's an area that actually we have very conflicting experiences with.
Yes.
In theory, hyperthreading for DAWs should be a problem. At least it certainly was. It may be changing a little bit with some of the FPU implementations that are coming out now.
Right.
But in essence, there's only one FPU on one core. And if both of your threads want to do floating point, which guess what DAWs do?
Stack a floating point.
They do floating point all the time.
Yep.
And in theory, it's like the worst possible workload to use hyperthreading with. But in practice, people get completely different results. Mm-hmm. And I've seen some claims that it's to do with the actual workload level. Like when, if you're almost saturating things, then it's bad. And if you're not saturating them, then it's okay. Our general position when people ask about this stuff is you need to try both and see what happens on your system.
Yep, of course.
But I would say our code makes sure that it tries to only discover how many physical cores you have. And I think that's right. Anyway, let me just have a look on my machine for a second on preferences.
So, and also,
I don't even know what this is.
Also, Paul, do you? So you don't have any set limits to the maximum number of cores?
No, absolutely not, and we never will.
Okay, but do you actually have any practical experience of how Ardour behaves with, let's say above 32 cores? Because there seems to be this 32 thread limit that. And again, I'm not a code guy, but this is just from practical experience that anything above 32, whether they're physical or logical, anything above that, everything starts going a bit squirrely. And this is the ongoing discussion that I've been having with multiple DAW developers and Pete. So
I have a 16-core Threadripper in front of me.
And do you have your multi? So they don't call it hyperthreading. I can't remember what they call it. SMT, I think they call it. So do you have all 32 logical available?
I generally run, so the default in Ardour is to use one less than the number of physical cores that you have.
Right.
So I'm using 15 real-time threads for processing.
Okay, but do you have your SMT switched off at the BIOS level on this machine?
And I believe I have it switched off, so I don't test it.
So it's only seeing 16. Okay, right.
Yeah. Now, in theory, so my answer to the question about the performance is very much like Justin's in a way, is the sense that, what you're going to see in terms of performance is going to depend an awful lot on the signal routing within the program.
Yep.
If you literally have 16 or 32 or 64 tracks and they just feed the master bus, you're going to get perfect parallelism. And for every track you add, every core is going to give you almost linear speed up. But the moment you start using buses to share processing and so forth, then you're back to, now this thread that would have processed the bus has to wait for all the other guys.
Yes. Yep.
And the synchronization primitives that are available on any given platform, even if we use them wrapped up in the POSIX APIs, they're going to be exactly the same as are going to be used by anybody else. And so if there is a lot of overhead to just synchronizing 32 threads, they're going to show up in Ardour as well. But I would say that, to be honest, I think within the team of core developers, we rarely test this. We certainly never test on Windows. None of us even runs Windows. So, it wouldn't be possible for us to test it. We do have a few users who do, very large session tests of, 1 to 3,000 tracks and stuff like that. And we've never had any data back from users that would suggest that our threading is a problem. That doesn't mean that it's not a problem.
Yeah. So this is not going to rear its head unless you start getting above a particular logical core count. So with MMCSS, it has to be above 14. So if you're running a 6-core CPU, even with your hyperthreading
it's
on,
not an issue.
You're not going to see it. So this is the brick wall that we hit. And the surprising thing for me was that, and Pete is absolutely sick of me talking about MMCSS.
I could tell.
It's a good argument.
I'm sorry, Pete, but look, myself and Pete and a couple of the other guys in the back end, we fought very, very hard to at least present the problem, and we got a what we call the unofficial MMCSS fix. So we were able to actually raise the thread limit, and it alleviated the problem. It actually eliminated the problem for using that unofficial fix. And what surprised me was that we were 3 years on. I mean, literally 3 years on, Paul. I'm doing interviews with DAW developers, and they were completely blindsided by the shift from MMCSS from user mode to kernel, and they had no idea that the thread limits had been put in place. And one of them actually messaged me and said, "Hey, I just ran into this weird problem with an MMCSS thread limit. Have you heard about it?" And this was in 2021, and we'd had worked in 2018 to get the fix out, and I presented that unofficial fix to this DAW developer who implemented it and fixed the problem, right? Some didn't take up the offer.
I mean, so I mean, from my perspective, this really goes back to, one of the huge differences for us between the world of our Windows users and our Linux users. And the numbers in those two cases are all about the same. It's roughly 50-50. The macOS users are a tiny fraction.
Oh, right. Okay.
And basically, from our perspective, the Windows users, well, other than money, from our perspective, the Windows users may as well not even exist. They, compared to the feedback and the testing and the interaction that we get from the users on Linux, the Windows users just may as well not exist. I mean, there are possibly, I'm trying to think the last time that anybody filed a bug report or talked on the forums about any actual problem, i.e. something that's not just, user misunderstanding or our poor software design, that was Windows specific.
Now, is that because the Windows development was pretty late in the game? I'm
not sure. I mean, my own theory is just Windows users do not expect to participate in this kind of process.
I don't. No,
Vin, I think that's probably fair here. Like the chances are the types of Windows users you're getting are users as opposed to participants for this application.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. And I think, I mean, they'll certainly show up on KVR or on Gearspace or whatever and, talk about stuff there. But, it's just a completely different kind of an interaction style. And I think, even the idea that, I don't know, like I'll give you an example. I got nerd sniped on Hacker News a couple of days ago. There's a discussion about a new open source DAW that's called Z-Rhythm that's under development. And somebody on there was talking about, do any of the open source DAWs have VST hiding so that you can only have one plugin window at a time instead of having them all popping up all over the screen, having to manage them? And, I was reading that and thinking, that's got to be like 5 minutes worth of work. And I went in and added VST hiding. So there's an option now that just says only show me one plugin window at a time.
Okay.
Nice.
And that particular user is somebody who actually uses Linux most of the time, although they have Ardour, but they don't tend to use it very much. But that kind of interaction where somebody brings up an idea and we respond to it, I mean, at the moment, because of version 7 development, we're not doing it. But in the past, there's been lots of cases where people will, come to us with again, I'm thinking of going back to stuff Justin was talking about, where he said something about, the right bug report saves you so much time and effort.
Of course.
It's also true when you get the right feature request, right? When somebody understands like what it means to talk to an actual developer instead of a customer support person, and they can frame their request in the right way. And in this case, this is a person who exactly how to frame it in a way that left me unable to do anything other than like, yes, master, I'll do it.
Okay.
Right? But the Windows users, I just don't think they have any experience of that. Their concept of interacting with the company is customer support, right? Whereas our Linux users fully understand a lot of the time you interact with support mechanisms for software. It means you're actually going to talk to the developers themselves.
Yeah.
And I think it just creates a whole different culture and a whole different ethos around, what they feel comfortable suggesting.
We see similar things on Windows where if you take the community that are the early adopters, like the insiders, the type of feedback they write versus the general population is completely different. It's completely different.
Well, just the point I want to make with that is that, we're talking about Reaper a lot, but because it's probably the closest parallel to Ardour in some ways, but obviously not in many other ways. But if we flip that and say the feedback from the Windows community on Reaper compared to the feedback from the Linux community on Reaper is completely reversed to what you're saying, Paul. So my point was, is it because of the late, you came to Windows late in the game? So for me, there was a period of about 7 or 8 years. I hadn't even thought of Ardour. Then it came out in 2016. And just to finish the point, spoke to a very close friend and colleague who's completely platform agnostic. And I said, hey, I've got Paul coming on the show. And he says, from Ardour, he goes, is what? And he was completely oblivious that it was on Windows. I mean, he missed the memo, Paul.
Mm-hmm. Well, thankfully, thousands of his fellow Windows users didn't miss the memo.
Didn't miss the memo, yes. But what I'm saying is that there are power users out there.
No, so Vin, here's the difference, and you're I know aware, I think, of this question about scripting. The reason why Reaper's done this is because of scripting and skinning. And, this is one of these areas. I mean, I'm not sure if either of you have read my piece about, whether or not open source is really a diversion from what users want.
Yes, I have been reading that, yes.
And I think that this is really why there's such a big difference with the Reaper community, is because the Reaper community feels correctly as well that they are able to be really to accomplish things with Reaper through Reaper scripting and to a lesser extent through skinning it, without or they don't consider themselves to be programmers,
right?
And this attracts a huge amount of devotion and love and loyalty. And that's what you see within the Reaper community.
Yes.
You can do just amazing things with the scripting capabilities there. And I think that's why in the Reaper community, I mean, none of the people that you're referring to as power users on Reaper are people that would be contributing to the development of Ardour if they were Ardour users.
Right.
We have a few people like that floating around in the Ardour community. There's a guy that's done some amazing videos and scripting work to build sample libraries, for example,
right,
inside of Ardour. But those people are just working at the scripting level. They would never get involved in the source code.
The source code, yeah, correct.
And I think that the difference with Reaper is that people feel very empowered to do remarkable things without having to build the software, right? They can just write a script and they can look up how to do that. It's not that complicated. And you have a file somewhere and you stick it in and it starts doing stuff. And the thing about Ardour and this is what that piece, the written piece is about for me, it's a little frustrating in a way when essentially we give you the whole thing, right?
The whole enchilada.
Yeah, we're not telling you, oh, you can only do in a script what we put in the scripting API. We're telling you, no, you can change anything you want, anything at all. The whole thing is open. You can read all the source code, change whatever you want. And the result of that, and I understand why, but I'm not trying to sound disappointed or frustrated, but the result of that for most people is like, well, yeah, but so what? Like I don't write C++. You're asking me, you're actually telling me I have to compile this thing?
Yeah.
Like, there are even instructions for how to do that on Windows. And I heard that even you guys don't do it on Windows, which is true. Like we don't build the Windows versions on Windows, we build them on Linux. So I think it's, one of the reasons I think Reaper has been so successful and has attracted the loyalty and adoration of so many of the people that use it is because it just puts immense power in the hands of people who don't think of themselves as programmers.
As code guys, yep.
And the problem in Ardour is that in theory, you could do way more with the program than you could ever do with Reaper. But all the people who would do that, all the people who would be inspired to do that, don't care because they're never going to get into C++ and compiling and all that kind of thing. And I think that what can you call it? That feeling spills over into the community in general. Like not just about the scripting, but I think, like the just general level of popularity and sort of visibility.
Yep.
There's a lot more people who will rave about Reaper than will rave about Ardour, and they'll do it more publicly and in places where more people will see it.
Yes. Yeah. Okay. Yeah.
And I think that really is the big difference with why Reaper's been, as successful as it's been on Windows in particular, although it's increasingly doing quite well on Linux now. So,
well, look, one thing that I am going to do is I am going to build some of these DAWbench sessions into Ardour, and we're going to be throwing it at some really large core machines as well. Once I get these sessions up, because I'm interested to see how it does behave with that threading. I mean, to me, it's I can understand to a certain degree that there is not a large majority of users with these higher core machines, but there is enough of them to be able to get the DAW manufacturers and developers at least interested to start testing on some of these higher core systems and seeing how the threading behaves. So, I mean, I've thrown some stuff at Justin recently where we were navigating this really strange, or not strange, but it's just an odd kind of dynamic with the way that it was reserving resources that would increase depending on the number of cores and memory and the amount of memory, but to the point where we could load a test session idling and it would reserve 100% of the CPU and lock the machine out. Wouldn't crash the machine, but Task Manager had 100% CPU usage across 36 logical cores. I hadn't hit play, and I thought, what the hell is it doing? So I'm working with Justin at the moment with that, and I think we got Pete in the middle of that one as well now.
So this comes back to a couple of points that I'd like to make in that area. I think one of them is that I'd say in general, Ardour tends to have a lot more performance problems with its user interface than it does with its handling of computer hardware, although some of that might be biased by the fact that I use it almost exclusively on Linux.
Right.
I know that we have issues with like huge numbers of MIDI notes, not playing them. The playing them works just fine, but they can just make our user interface crawl like molasses.
Okay.
Like cold molasses.
Is this Linux or across all?
It's across all the platforms.
Okay.
I mean, the level of the effect depends on the platform a bit, and it depends on which Mac OS X SDK we built against, which is another current problem that we're facing, that the latest versions of the SDK are required to get Waves plugins to not draw upside down. But if we build with that SDK, our whole user interface slows down to a crawl.
Now, how did that come about? What is it changing the SDK?
We don't know. We're not the only DAW that has seen it. It's happened in some other ones. It seems to be completely. It's which SDK was the DAW built with on Mac OS.
Oh,
and if it's built with the earlier ones, then the Waves GUIs are upside down, and they're upside down and inside out, I think, or something weird. No, maybe just upside down. Anyway, so most of our performance problems these days, the ones that I know about, are much more with the GUI than how we handle, the hardware of the machine.
It's threading, yeah.
The other thing I was going to say was that another big difference between Ardour, and this is true of Mixbus as well, and a lot of the other DAWs, and particularly the direction they've been going in the recent past with these hybrid engine things, Ardour is never going to do that.
And that was the next question. There you go.
And I'll tell you why we're not going to do that. This is a decision that we made a long time ago. Our goal is that the DSP load, which is to say, if you're working with a 3 millisecond buffer, how much of the 3 milliseconds gets used for processing. We want that to be constant no matter what the user does.
Yes.
We don't want dropping into record to change the DSP load. We don't want starting and stopping the transport to stop the DSP load. We don't want anything to change the DSP load, because we don't want the user to do something on a fairly big session and suddenly find everything starts breaking up.
Yes.
So if it doesn't work, when I say it doesn't work, if it's clicking and popping and, there's underruns and all the rest of it, when you're stopped, it doesn't work. Okay? We are not going to play games to try to eke out some level of performance that if the user does X, Y, and Z, you can't use those games anymore, and now the session can't actually be handled.
Yeah.
So if you're running Ardour on a machine and you see, a given DSP load, that's the DSP load.
Yeah, you know where the bodies are buried.
The bodies are buried. It is not going to change.
Yep.
Now, you know, when I look at some of the games that some of the DAWs are trying to play now to eke out, you know, relatively marginal improvements in what kind of load, you know, you can throw at them. To me, I'm thinking, well, first of all, it's a major engineering effort, which I don't want to undertake, and I'm not really sure why they do either. But it also puts users at, I say at risk. I mean, they're not going to lose their lives or even their hearing, but it is putting them in a situation where they don't really know what is going to happen when they do X, Y, or Z.
Yep.
And I think that is bad for users. I think you should expect to get constant DSP load regardless of what you're doing. So in Ardour, the plugins run all the time. When you stop the transport, the plugins are running. When you start the transport, the plugins are running.
Yes.
When you're recording, the plugins are running. Everything is exactly the same regardless of what you're doing. So if the DSP load is working for you in one situation, it's going to work in others. Now, you know, there's a few exceptions to that. Some of them can be a bit machine dependent. Denormals and reverbs can flip things in the wrong direction. But fundamentally, we aim to have as constant a DSP load given the current size of the session as possible.
But that was a given pre all the hybrid engine, right?
Absolutely.
So, and the only two DAWs that had hybrid engines was Logic, right, with all of its caveats attached, and Samplitude with even more caveats attached.
Yeah.
And the whole thing with a hybrid engine really came about with I know exactly why Steinberg developed that hybrid engine, and that was because the performance variable between OSX and Windows, which, you know, I was the guy that highlighted it, but they were looking at that going, what is going on there? And that's to do with core audio versus ASIO and some other underlying things. But when I did that shootout between OSX and Windows, back, you know, it's going back 10 years now, and I did a whole series of tests across multiple DAWs, and it was very, very consistent that without a hybrid engine, Cubase on OSX would never, ever get anywhere near the real-time latency, low latency performance and efficiency of the Windows machine. So this is where the whole hybrid engine came out. And then trying to navigate that across plugins and then getting it navigated across to how virtual instruments were behaving. And then it was throwing all these other bombs that, you know, if you're using VEP, for example, which has got another secondary buffer because it's a second application where you're actually feeding into Cubase, that didn't like the hybrid engine at all, the ASIO guard, so you had to switch it off. And then we came full circle, because then if you switched it off in Cubase 10, you lost half of your logical cores, right? So is there caveats attached? You betcha, but everyone has gone that hybrid engine route, you know, pretty much.
I actually think Reaper has something to do with it too. And I think the reason Reaper has something to do with it is because it's obvious to anybody that plays around with it that Reaper seems to be able to handle higher loads, if you like.
But they did it in reverse. They did it in reverse, kind of, Paul. The anticipative processing, their buffer is at the start, right? And then it's somewhat different, but I think sometime last year, I spent a long time trying to understand exactly what Justin was doing with that, and maybe trying to understand why. And I don't know why I didn't just call him and ask him why, but that might have been easier.
my understanding, or my take on this, goes like this. So if you have a relatively light load, and let's just say that, I don't know, we'll make the numbers not real numbers because you can't do them on most machines, but let's say that you've got a 100 millisecond buffer. I know that's long. It makes the numbers easy. And you've got enough load in the session that you only use 50 milliseconds to actually do the processing, right? In effect, you are, if you do everything in real time with absolute lowest latency, you are effectively wasting half of the 100 millisecond buffer because you're finished in 50 milliseconds, and then you can't do anything else until the next buffer time, right? And so you're basically just idling. And I think Justin looked at this situation and basically said, well, that's kind of stupid. Like, why would you waste half of the available time when you could use that for anticipative processing of what's coming down the line. And, I mean, he's not a stupid guy. He understands how that introduces latency and so on. But to him, that made sense as a trade-off, right? It's like if you do everything in what in Ardour we call the process thread, basically the one that handles the callback from ASIO or Core Audio or ALSA or whatever. Mm-hmm. If you do all your processing right there, you run the risk of not using all the CPU power you have available. And so Reaper's design is awesome in the sense that it means you can actually tap 100% of the CPU power you have available at the cost of additional latency. Not latency on the output, but latency, say you're moving a fader up on a track.
Yep.
You won't hear that fader move for 100 or 200 milliseconds. Right?
Oh, it's not as long as that, but I understand what you're saying.
Well, it's user controllable what it is. I mean, 200 milliseconds used to be the default. Maybe it's changed now, but you can adjust it. But that's the price that you pay. Now, in Ardour, we made a commitment very early on that we are going to do everything with the lowest latency possible. And so we are not going to add any kind of an anticipatory processing because necessarily that affects the latency of your use of a control service or something else. Mm-hmm. But I completely understand why Justin did that because the results speak for themselves. You can run a bigger session in Reaper without dropouts than you can in almost any other DAW. Yeah,
and still running the native hardware latency.
Yeah.
So where the approach with the other DAW developers was we're going to have a 25 to 50 millisecond playback latency on your playback tracks, but then when you track arm it, we're going to force what you've track armed to whatever your hardware buffer is. So there's all of this additional arbitration.
Yeah, that type of stuff I just regard as crazy. So in Ardour, if your buffer's 3 milliseconds long, Ardour's got 3 milliseconds to do what it has to do.
Yep.
And it either gets it done or it doesn't. There's no fun and games, trying to work behind the scenes to see if we can get this stuff ready ahead of time.
Yep.
That when that buffer's ready or needs to be filled, we start doing the work and we hopefully get it done in time. But that means that all of your control surfaces, all of your GUI interactions all have the lowest latency.
Yep.
And we don't have to have some crazy, the engineering aspect of this stuff is just mind-boggling. It introduces layers of complexity into these programs that I just, okay, so you get to run a few more tracks, but just buy a few more cores.
Look, it is an interesting area. I've never been convinced by any of the hybrid engines. They seem to work okay for a lot of people, but if you read those series of posts that I put up where I was just giving some examples of where, simply track arming a multi-instrument version of, you've got an instance of contact with multiple instruments and you track arm, and then it doesn't only force the instrument on the track that you track arm, it forces all of the instruments down to the buffer, to the playback buffer. It was, you see all this massive spiking, sessions clipping, and I've just thought all I did was hit track arm. That's all I did. I track armed something. Where with the earlier version with our multimedia class scheduler fix, you track armed exactly the same session. Nothing happened. Exactly. Zero.
It all uses the hardware buffer size, and that's just the way it is.
No, not even to that point. I actually had the hybrid buffer actually playing. Right, but I could turn the hybrid buffer on and off and track arm, and it would respond in exactly the same way. This is the thing, again, from a non-code perspective, I've gone, I think that actually works better,
Yeah.
So look, it is an interesting area, and I think we'll be probably talking about hybrid engines and multiprocessing way more in the future as well, I think. Now, one thing, because we are starting to stretch. This is going to be a long one, guys.
Yeah.
I think what we should do now, Paul, you wanted to quickly talk, well, maybe not quickly, but you wanted to talk about. You mentioned the zeitgeist that Ableton Live created. Do you want to just give us some thoughts on that?
Yeah, sure. So, go back to before Live came along, and with the exception of a few, at that time, relatively super niche audio software tools, pretty much all the DAWs were all about linear timelines, right? And whether you were doing electronic composition, whether you were recording orchestras, whether you were recording jazz trios, solo piano, singer-songwriters, whatever, essentially the model was the one that we all inherited from Pro Tools, which in turn inherited it from some combination of Cakewalk and actual tape machines.
Or Cubase, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, like, you know, there's a timeline and you record and you stick things on the timeline and you locate the playhead and you play them back.
Yes.
Live showed up. You know, Gerhardt started working on Live in 99, just the same time as I started working on Ardour, and essentially totally changed how particularly most younger people think about doing in-the-box composition.
100%. Yep, I agree with that.
And even not necessarily in the box composition, but to some extent just how you work on a new piece. I mean, it might not even be an electronic piece when it's finished, but how you start. And that all came, my take on it is it all came from this clip launching model where things are not on a timeline. Things are locked to the tempo map, and we stretch them and shrink them as we need to. Everything starts and stops on a user-defined quantization boundaries. And guess what? When you do that, it becomes like a game, right? It's, you know, there were games. I remember my kids had some very early like sequencer things where they had samples, and I remember them sitting in front of a TV screen, and I mean, it's like super primitive, you know, grid sequencing or something. The whole thing becomes a game, and almost everything that you try kind of works. And instead of having to think about much lower level details of recording and composition, you start thinking about song structure, and you start thinking about creating movement and creating interest. And in that sense, I think Live was just completely revolutionary in that respect. And I really haven't seen anybody doing computer-based composition or, you know, having computers play a large role in the music that they perform that isn't doing something that is somehow inspired by what Live let people do. And so that's sort of part one. I mean, part two is, but I think this is kind of going away. When I've been hunting around to look at, you know, what people are doing with Live these days, even with Live itself, not just like with DAWs in general, with Live itself, an awful lot of the people that even Ableton wants to put out as the people, like, you know, people doing cutting edge music with Live, they're not really doing clip launching anymore.
No.
Or at least it doesn't really form the heart of what they're doing. And so for me, I'm almost wrapped up here. I mean, it's just this interesting thing where Ableton came in and said that basically, like, you know, elastic time, beat stretching, time stretching, locked to the tempo map, all this stuff. This is really fundamental. And eventually all the other DAWs have had to jump along either all the way or some of the way. But now Ableton itself is being used by a lot of people in ways that are not so dependent on that kind of workflow at all. No,
back to a more linear type of workflow. Yes.
Yeah, and so I now wonder, like, you know, what are things look like in 5 years? Do we get another innovation that's at the same level as what Live gave us, or have we actually reached some sort of steady state now where we've got all the features and we've got all the workflows, and people will just mix and match and do whatever they want? So, and I'm having to think about that in the context of Ardour, because we're adding clip launching into Ardour and thinking about, you know, how much does this even matter? Like, you know, maybe we're 20 years too late here, or maybe this is just an important workflow that continues to be necessary going forward.
Well, I'll tell you, Paul, that I mentioned that to one of my close friends who has multiple workflows depending on what kind of music he's working on. So he'll work in Ableton for a very specific type of more electronic or, you know, loop-based type of work, or he'll work in Reaper for more linear. And when I've just said, well, they're going to be introducing this clip launching thing into Ardour, he goes, that's very, very clever, because a lot of people would love to be able to do it all in one DAW, Paul. I don't think it's going to, you know, introducing clip launching is going to have a huge impact on Ableton uses, for example, or Bitwig, which is very, very similar in its approach.
Yeah.
Those people, those DAWs do attract very specific type of workflows. But as you're saying, Ableton has now started becoming like a primary DAW for even more of people that are approaching it in more like a traditional linear approach. Yeah. So they have come full circle, haven't they?
Yeah, and in fact, I know from conversations with Gerhard that it was always their goal. I mean, he's been really, not just talking to me. I know the first Loop conference, I don't know which version they were releasing then, but he was adamant, Ableton wasn't supposed to be that weird, funky tool that you use to do that weird, funky stuff. The goal was always it was going to be your DAW for everything.
Yes.
It's just that, as we know with Ardour, as we even know with Reaper, as we know with all the DAWs, it can take a little while to get there, right? And they are now starting to focus a little bit more on their linear timeline stuff because they've already done all of the non-linear part of it.
Yeah.
It will be interesting to see where this ends up in, several years.
Yeah, no, definitely. And look, another DAW that comes to mind. Well, DAW, when it first came out, calling it DAW was a bit of a stretch, but things like, FL Studio, or it was called Fruity Loops back then, you couldn't even record audio into it.
That's right.
It was basically just clip launching. That's 100% what it did. And there's been amazing productions coming out of that platform as well. So
very much so. And Fruity Loops to me, in fact, if I was going to say, if I can still see an idea that's floating around out there that isn't really in most other DAWs, the Fruity Loops workflow would be the one. Like you can't do the Fruity Loops workflow in Live, you can't do it in Logic, you can't do it in Reaper, you can't do it in Bitwig. It's a totally different way of working.
Yes.
And I don't know if, it's been successful, but so far it hasn't convinced any of the other DAW makers or any new DAWs to come along and try to copy it.
Copy it, yeah. I think it's quite unique in that sense. Yeah. So there you go. Well, look, there's always room for improvement, with any of the DAWs, I suppose. But we'll see what the future brings. Hey, I tell you what, guys, this has been great, and I reckon we could probably lock in for another couple of hours. But It's over the 2.5 hour mark, I would think. Yeah. So I think what we should do, and yes, here comes that term, Pete. I'm going to put a pin in it. So let's put a pin in this now. And Paul, you are more than welcome to come back again.
Oh, definitely.
And after the 7, let's put in a little schedule in after the 7 launch. I'll be in contact again. I'll get you to come back and we can pick up the ball from here. And I think that'll be awesome.
Sure, that'd be great.
So both of you guys, thank you very, very much for your time and energy today.
Thank you, Vin. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Absolutely, my pleasure. And thank you to everyone that is still listening in at this time mark. And with that, guys, on to the next.